Let me tell you a little bit more about me. Uh, for those of you who don't know me very well, uh, I've been blessed by the good Lord with a job I consider my hobby since I was in high school. When I was in high school, I was working in a community pharmacy called Cinnaminson Drug in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. My hometown is Palmyra, New Jersey. And I had believed I had been called to do something in medicine. So I took a job while I was in high school at Cinnaminson Drug, and the pharmacist there was Bernie Morgenstern. And Bernie ended up retiring here in Florida, but he was a graduate of Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science. And one day he came in and said, "So you want to be a pharmacist?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You want to have a pharmacy like this someday?" He had an independent pharmacy there in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. And I said, "No, Bernie, I want to teach doctors and pharmacists how to use drugs." He looked at me and said, "Boy, you smoking pot? That's not what we do." And this is in the 1960s. True story. So I've been blessed by the good Lord with teaching evidence-based drug therapy since day one in my pharmacy career. I graduated in 71 with my BS in pharmacy, did a residency 71, 72 in the hospital, and then went to get my doctor of pharmacy at Philadelphia, graduated there in 74. And from there went to West Virginia University for 5 years that my wife hated. So she said, "We can't stay here." It was cold, and she was a school teacher and she was driving. And even in the wintertime with the coal trucks on the road and they use cinders instead of salt. And she said, "I can't take it here." She's a South Carolina girl. So we moved back to Charleston, South Carolina, Medical University in 1979. And that's where I've been ever since. And I officially retired 14 years ago. But when I retired, my wife told me two things. You can't stay home with me, and you got to keep me the way I'm accustomed to being kept. So I'm still teaching 3 days a week. I'm still consulting. I'm still speaking. I just joined the national board for Rocksteady Boxing, and I've had Parkinson's disease for 12 years. So I'm now on their national board. It's a volunteer position, so I don't have any conflict of interest. And I feed the homeless 2 nights a week. Used to be three, I'm down to two. But it's 7 nights a week, and I'm involved with two of those. I've been doing that for 12 years. I'm still a consultant to a free clinic as a pharmacy consultant. And I'm staying busy. I want to wear out, not rust out. And I have a granddaughter who's graduating from uh, high school, going to probably to Clemson University. She wants to be an aerospace engineer. And so she's graduating in May. And then my grandson is a freshman and he plays sports as well as academically gifted. So he's a pitcher on the varsity baseball team as a freshman. And he also plays big man on the basketball court. So I now have to look up to him. I'm getting shorter, he's getting higher. So I was 6 foot, I'm down to 5'9". So that's what happens when you get chronologically gifted. And in my case, optically impaired and follically challenged. So I hope that you enjoy this time here in this beautiful location. And again, I hope I don't get distracted by the wonderful view because I get to see it better than you do because that's what I'm looking at the whole time. So if I look over your heads, I see that beautiful view. But I am so glad to see so many people that I've known over the years. And this is the biggest crowd we've had since pre-pandemic. So it's wonderful to see so many people here. And those of you online, I'd like to welcome you as well. So thanks for being here. And please feel free to stop, interrupt as we go. You don't have to hold your questions. I'll try and give you an opportunity to ask questions periodically. But if you have something that just won't wait, go ahead and ask. You're not going to bother me at all. And hopefully you may have to remind me, but I need to repeat the question for those online. I don't, Andy? It's persnickety.
Sure, it wouldn't be.
Okay.
Now it should.
Yes, you got it. And is there a back button? Yeah. Okay. I don't have any disclosures. I haven't spoken for industry in over a dozen years. I don't serve on any industry advisory boards, so I don't think I have any conflicts of interest. So hopefully that will be the case. I'm going to start off with an update on immunizations. This is one of the places that it's an ever-changing target, and with many of us involved in primary care, we are not doing a very good job immunizing people today, and we're starting to see diseases come back. We'll talk more a little bit later this morning about measles is coming back, and we could lose our position as a country where measles has been eradicated. It's coming back that bad. What we're seeing with COVID vaccines, what we're seeing with RSV vaccines, we are minimally immunizing folks. It's in the 20% range. Okay. We've got a long, long way to go. So I want to start with an update on probably the most, not concerning, but the most complicated of the updated guidelines because it, again, has changed multiple times. And this is for pneumococcal disease. Uh-oh. Andy, what did I do? It's stuck again. It forgets. Which one do I push to get it to go?
It's the same thing, and here you still like it. What? Any of these things will work now. Okay. And this thing isn't working?
Now it is.
Okay.
Let's hopefully it continues to work.
Demon out.
We have a demon in the room. This is the updated CDC guidelines currently for pneumococcal vaccines. And this is going to change again because we have at least 2 or 3 additional pneumococcal vaccines under development right now. But if you go back, you remember with the old Prevnar, used to be Prevnar 7. Then it went to Prevnar 13. Now it's Prevnar 20. And Merck has got 2 different vaccines that are still available. They have the polysaccharide Pneumovax 23, and they also have Vacnuvance, which is a conjugated vaccine with 15 strains in it. So right now we have 3 that are still on the market. 7 and 13 are gone. So the Pfizer Wyeth one is Prevnar 20. The Merck still has Pneumovax 23 and Vacnuvance, which is the conjugated pneumococcal vaccine, 15 variants in it. Now, the conjugated vaccines are more effective than the polysaccharide vaccines. And that's why we don't use Pneumovax 23 in kids. It's not effective. We used to use Prevnar 7 and then Prevnar 13. Now we can use Prevnar 20, or we could use Vacnuvance, which is PCV 15. So those are the only 2 that are approved in kids. And since they're slightly more effective, that's where we go. Well, several years ago, we had some data suggesting since didn't have all of our kids immunized, we didn't have good herd immunity, which means enough kids are immunized and we weren't seeing pressure for those strains in the vaccine as we get older. We did away with the Prevnar 13 for everybody who's 65 and older, and you could give Pneumovax 23 without Prevnar 13. Now that we have Vacnuvance and Prevnar 20, they're back for people 65 and older. So this is for patients here that adults 65 and older, I highlighted in red up there at the top, even though it says recommendation for those 19 and older. This is 65 and older who have underlying conditions. And what you'll notice here, it gives you let me come over here so I can point it out to you a little bit better. I'm not a good pointer user with my Parkinson's disease. It would just shake up there. and you might get seasick. Uh, so if they've only had PCV7, then they get either PCV20, or you can give a single dose of PCV15, but a year later, you have to follow it up with PPSV23, Pneumovax 23. So if you give the 20, you don't need the 23. If you give the 15, you also need the 23. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's the where we are. And the reason it says a year, it's not from clinical data. The clinical data says you should actually be able to give Pneumovax 23 8 weeks after a dose of Vacnavance or Prevnar. But CMS won't pay for it.
It's off, right?
CMS only pays for a second pneumococcal vaccine if you submit the claim at least 11 months after the first one. So what the CDC did, they changed their guidance for those 65 and older to say a year. Then it's covered under CMS. Does that make sense? But you don't have to wait a year for those less than 65, but you can give it as soon as 8 weeks. So there's a disconnect there as well. So that's for people who only had the original vaccine. Those who've had PPSV23, Pneumovax, which was the most recent thing that had been recommended before we got these two new vaccines. Because we went from PCV 13, then we went to that's optional, but we want everybody to get PPSV 23 at age 65. That was what we had before these two new vaccines. So they can get a single dose of PCV 20 at least a year after the dose of PPSV 23. Again, it's that year because these are 65 and older. So CMS is going to pay for that if you submit the claim a year. It has to be at least 11 months. You can also give a single dose of PCV 15 at least a year since the last dose of PPS 23. You don't need to give another dose of PPS 23 if they just had one after age 65. So you can update that PPS 23 with either one of these new conjugated vaccines with no additional doses. And the same thing here, if they've had 15 and 23 is available, then you can do the same thing. If they've had PCV 13 only, which was a fair number of folks, they need a dose of PCV 20, or they don't need another dose of the 15 doesn't qualify here because they've already had the 13. It's too close to the 13. They just need to get a year interval since the last dose of 13 to get a PPSV 23. And the same thing on this one here. Okay. So those are the three major categories you'll like to run into. And these were published in MMWR, which is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC in Atlanta. And these recommendations, first, there are three things that need to happen before when you get to this. First, you need to have an FDA-approved vaccine. Second, you have the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP. They make a recommendation, they take a formal vote, and recommend to the CDC what to do. And then when the CDC accepts it, they publish it in MMWR, and then it's an official recommendation by the CDC. Then it goes into their formal recommendations. But it's a three-step process for almost every one of these things I'm going to show you this morning. Okay? Well, did it go? No. There. Okay. Okay. So this is the recommendation for 19 to 64-year-olds. The first one was 65 and above. This is 19 to 60. Oh, why'd it go back? There. 19 to 64 who are immunocompromised or high risk. And down here are the conditions we're talking about. Those who have chronic renal failure, congenital acquired asplenia, which would be your sickle cell patients, your patients with acquired immunodeficiency, including lymphocyte deficiency, complement deficiencies, all these folks, nephrotic syndrome, multiple myeloma, leukemia, radiation, hemoglobinopathy, solid tumors, transplant, those kind of folks. So for these folks, if they've only had PCV7 at any age, they get a single dose of PCV20, or they can get PCV15 and a year later, PPSV23. If you look at those who've had PPSV23 only, they get a single dose of PCV20 at least a year later, or they can get a single dose of PCV15 a year later since the last dose of PPSV23. And for those who've had PCV13 only, a year later, they can get PCV20, or they can get a PPSV23 a year later. They don't need it since they've already had the 13. The 15 is not going to give them additional protection. So that's the recommendations there. And if they've had PCV13 and 23, there's no recommendation at this point in time until the patient turns 65. Okay. And then they would get ideally PCV20. So that's the guideline there. And whoop, I think there was one more that I skipped ahead of. Yeah, these are the chronic medical conditions. We're now good? Oh, thank you.
Change better.
Because okay, that's okay. We'll get it. We'll get it. So these are the chronic medical conditions that are not immunocompromised, but renal failure, lung disease, so asthma, COPD, smokers, liver disease, you name it, diabetes. So these are the folks here. And if they've had basically PCV7 only at any age, they get PCV20 or 15 followed a year later by 23. If they've had 23 only, they get PCV20 at least a year after the last dose of PPSV23, and they could also get a dose of PCV15. And if they've had only the 13, then a year later, they can get a single dose of PCV20, and there is no recommendation for PCV15 again. So one thing you'll notice is, and I don't have a preference, but the guidelines do give you more opportunity with PCV20 than you do with PCV15. Okay? And there are different strains. You get additional coverage with the 20 versus the 15, but you have them as schedule option A and schedule B. If 20 is available, that's the one you probably should use. If it's not, and you've got 15, use the 15. Okay, but if you use the 15, you may have to give, again, the PPSV23 with it, which you don't need with the 20. So that's the current guidelines. But it wouldn't surprise me that we have one or two additional pneumococcal vaccines approved in the next year, which means these guidelines will change again because they're going to have even more strains covered. And what we've seen, why did we go from 7 to 13 to 20 with the conjugated vaccine? We did it because the strains we were seeing changed when we started to use that vaccine. So the 7 strains that were originally covered in PCV7, which were very, very prevalent at the time, fell away. We weren't seeing disease. We started to see additional strains pop up to cause the disease, and that's why they expanded it from 7 to 13. Same thing happened with 13. We started to see strains that were showing up that were not covered, and then we went to the 20. And now we're talking about increasing it even more. So stay tuned. This is going to be an ever-changing guideline or recommendation. So that was for adults. And originally, we only had, for pediatrics, we only had data for PCV13. Then This came out from the CDC. For the first time, we had an alternative to Prevnar 13. We used Vacnuvance. It was approved in kids. Originally, it was only approved in the adults. Now it's also approved in kids. So the CDC put this slide out in MMWR that you could interchangeably use PCV 13 and PCV 15 for children for their primary immunization against invasive pneumococcal disease and pneumonia. And then shortly after this, in April of last year, the CDC approved the Pfizer vaccine, the PCV 20, also for pediatric patients. And when that happened, Pfizer discontinued the PCV 13 because PCV 20 had all the indications that we had for Prevnar 13 were now included in Prevnar 20. So that's what they've done. They've discontinued the manufacture of the 13 and only manufacture and sell now the 20. So that's not uncommon. We see that happen. And this one does prevent invasive pneumococcal disease caused by 20 streptococcus strains among infants and children 6 weeks to 17 years of age, as well as otitis media from 6 to 5 years of age caused by the original 7 serotypes in Prevnar 7. So those are the indications for the vaccine. And it's a 4-dose series at 2, 4, 6, and then 12 through 15 months. First dose may be given at 6 weeks of age for those kids to make sure they get the 4 doses. So the primary series is using either Vacnuvance or Prevnar 20 in children between basically 6 weeks of age up through 15 months of age. So it was also a unanimous recommendation. So now we can give either 15 or 20, and there's no preference for one versus the other in pediatric patients. And if you use 15 in these pediatric patients, there's still no indication for PPSV 23 because we don't have good data for that vaccine in pediatric patients. Come on. Where are we? Andy, it's still here. I'm not good with this. It's stuck again. It's not, none of them are working. That's okay. Keeps freezing. There. All right, we'll try it again. So these are some investigational ones. Merck has a 21 valent that's in clinical trials right now, should be submitted to the FDA anytime now. So the data is there for it. And then what we say here is that it should cover 83% of invasive pneumococcal disease in individuals 65 and older and includes 8 unique serotypes not currently covered in any of the available vaccines. So it should be responsible for about 30% of invasive pneumococcal in individuals 65 and older. So that's what we know from Merck, and it has been submitted or in the process of being submitted to the FDA from Merck for this new PCV 21 from Merck. We also have Vax 24 and Vax 31 that are in phase 1 and 2 trials. So stay tuned. There's more to come with these pneumococcal vaccines. So that's the pneumococcal. Any questions on the pneumococcal vaccines? We're going to move ahead to just as a brief update on flu vaccine. 2 years ago, for the first time, the CDC changed their guidelines to prefer a specific flu vaccine or vaccines for people 65 and older. That was not the case previously. We have two that are only labeled for patients 65 and older. High-dose Fluzone and also not flu block, flu ad with the adjuvant. Those are the two that are labeled for 65 and older. But there's a third one that's in this guideline, and that's flu block. Now, Fluzone is 4 times more concentrated than regular Fluzone for the strains, the 4 quadrivalent strains of influenza that are included in it. So it's higher dose. So Fluzone high dose is high dose. Flu block is also high dose. It's 3 times more flu antigen than the traditional vaccines, and flu block is the only one of these that is made with recombinant DNA technology in the fall armyworm. It's not made in egg cell culture. And then the third one is Fluad, which is made the same way, and it's not high dose, but it has an adjuvant in it, squalene oil, to increase the immune response. So the CDC has said for the first time 2 years ago that we should use, if available, one of these 3 specific vaccines for patients 65 and older. So you have Fluad with the adjuvant, you have high-dose Fluzone, and you have basically flu block, which is also high dose. Those are the 3 that they recommend. Now, a couple of things. All flu vaccines, with one exception, have a universal expiration date. They all expire at the end of June. So the end of this June, this current flu vaccine that we've had since last fall will expire with one exception, and that's flu block. And it expires 9 months after the day it's manufactured. The others don't have, they have a specified end date, the end of June the following year. So flu block used to have a 6-month, it's now up to 9 months, but it's the only one you really need to pay attention to, because all the others, if you store it appropriately, you know they're going to expire the end of June. So they're still good until the end of June, except for flu block. Yes. Yes. There was a trial several years ago that was done by our friends at Sanofi when it was trivalent Fluzone versus high-dose Fluzone, 3 strains instead of 4. And what they found was that for about every 200 patients you treated, you had 1 less case of documented pneumococcal disease with a high dose in people 65 and older versus the regular Fluzone. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. We're talking flu. Yes, we do have that data. And we also have data for the Prevnar 20 showing the same thing, less pneumococcal disease. So those are the 2 we do have studies on. That study was from Netherlands. This one is actually United States with the high-dose Fluzone versus regular Fluzone. But your number you treat's right at 200. So you got to treat quite a few folks. But given that, and the immune response is less as we get older, that's why the higher dose or having the adjuvant is probably preferred, and now they do recommend it in the guidelines. So the advisory committee recommended it, as well as you see the vote was 15-0 by the advisory committee. It was unanimous that we should go to one of these 3 flu vaccines. Okay? So that's the only update from that. Going backward.
It's 24. I'm reading Paradise 24.
Wrong way. Now it's working.
Yes. Okay, thank you. That's 24.
This is recommendations from the advisory committee on timing of the flu vaccine. And typically, we don't want to give it too soon, because if we give it too soon, it'll wear off before you get to the end of the flu season in the springtime. So ideally, the CDC says the optimal time is probably October, before the end of October and after September. So the month of October is probably the optimal time to receive your flu vaccine to give you the best coverage through the flu season. Now, if they haven't already been immunized, then we can still give it after that, but we're going to realize we may have missed the front end of the flu season because it takes about 2 weeks for the vaccine to work, but the titers do decline. Now, it's not recommended, but I have a good friend who's an infectious disease specialist in Charleston who was with the Department of Health and Human Services running the vaccine program, Dr. Robert Ball. He's a character, but Robert says, I get one when it first comes out. I get another one in January. And if I still have some vaccine left at the end of the season, I get a third dose in June. There is no evidence, but that's what he does. I don't do that. I just wait until October. I usually I got to have it by Halloween. If I get it the week of Halloween, I'm great because it's before it starts. And then I'm good for the rest of the season. And again, what's interesting is most of us now are getting our flu vaccine from pharmacies. And I went to the pharmacy. I said, my wife and I both want the high dose vaccine. So I get home and see what they gave me. And they gave me Fluad. And Fluad is not high dose. It's the one with the adjuvant in it. It's got the same amount. It's still recommended, but at the time that I did this several years ago, there were none of these recommended by the CDC. So I went in and specifically asked for a high dose vaccine, the Fluzone high dose, and they gave me Fluad. Turns out it's not a big deal, but it's not what it's supposed to be. It is not a high dose vaccine. It's recommended. It's got an adjuvant, not high dose. Got the same amount of flu antigen as the standard flu vaccines. Vaccination during July and August can be considered for children of any age who require only one dose. And young children the first time around need 2 doses. Okay, so those are the current updated guidelines from the CDC for this current year that we just in the process of finishing. Flublok, standard dose flu head-to-head. So this is, again, a newer study that's just come out. And you can see it's New England Journal last year. And it's a randomized observational study from Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. And Kaiser in Northern California does a lot of our immunization studies for the CDC. And they either administered a high-dose recombinant influenza vaccine, Flublok, which is 3 times more concentrated than regular, or one of 2 standard dose influenza vaccines during the 2018-2019, 2019-2020 seasons to adults 50 to 64 years of age. So this is younger than 65, and we don't have any specific guidelines what vaccine to use in this group. They're all potentially appropriate, but high-dose Fluzone and Fluad have not been studied in this population. Flublok has, and this is data from Flublok. It's 559 participants, 2 cases per 1,000 tested positive for influenza in the Flublok group compared to 2.34 cases per 1,000 in the standard group. So it's vaccine and effectiveness is 15.3% more effective with Flublok than regular flu vaccine in this patient population. And you can see the confidence interval is all on the right side, about 6 to 24%. In the same age group, the relative vaccine effectiveness against influenza A was 15.7%. The recombinant vaccine was not significantly more effective against influenza-related hospitalization than standard dose. So we don't have a recommendation here. This suggests Flublok works, but it's not a whole lot better than standard flu vaccine. So this is the first outcome trial with Flublok. Questions on the flu vaccines? This is the COVID one. This is the update. And this, again, is a continuing to change landscape. So current COVID and high-dose flu together in people 65 and older. There's a concern that there might have been an increased risk of adverse events if you gave the COVID bivalent vaccine, which is not available anymore, along with your flu vaccine, the adjuvant flu vaccine, or high dose for 65 and older. So based on administrative files of more than 5.3 million Medicare beneficiaries, 65 and older, the Vaccine Safety Data Link said basically there were roughly 3 strokes or stroke-like events called TIAs, transient ischemic attacks, for every 100,000 doses given. Dr. Peter Marks, head of the FDA's Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, said he was planning to get his COVID-19 vaccine first, followed by his flu vaccine about 2 weeks later. But there's no guidance or recommendation. And we have not seen a continuation of this concern. And we no longer have a bivalent COVID vaccine. They're gone. So we don't really have any specific guidelines, but you could follow Dr. Mark's example and give them 2 weeks apart. If you're concerned at all, that would be what I'd recommend. We'll come back to COVID in a minute. Measles. This is something that is currently a very, very hot topic by the CDC. We have seen the largest outbreak in measles this year that we've seen in a long, long time in this country. So this is as April the 4th, earlier this month. There were 113 cases already reported from basically 18 different states. 58 cases were reported over the entire year in 2023. So we've more than doubled, and we're only a third of the way through, or not even a third of the way through the year. The reason is not enough kids are getting vaccinated. There's some interesting data here. For herd immunity, we need 95% of the kids to be immunized. If 95% of the kids are immunized, then we're not going to see measles. But what we're seeing by 2019, we're down to 86%. And in 2021, we're down to 81%. So it's going down during COVID. It went down significantly. So we're below the level required for herd immunity. And most of these cases are people who come to the United States who've not been immunized. They bring the cases in. We've seen outbreaks at Disney World, Disneyland, you name it, because visitors from foreign countries who have not been immunized bring measles in. And measles is very, very contagious. And if those people have not been immunized that are exposed in the United States, they get measles. And there's still lots of bad sequelae happening from measles. So the ACIP committee gave the green light to a second MMR vaccine, also Priorix by GSK, about a year ago. And you can give MMR by Merck, or you can give Priorix, either one. This is, again, a CDC slide that just came out. Almost all people in the US with measles either traveled internationally or were around someone who traveled internationally. So most of the cases are coming from other countries, and the people who are getting it here are those who've not been immunized. Here's the data specifically by age. So under 5 years of age, we're looking at 50% of the cases that are reported so far this year under 5. 5 to 19 is 23, 20 plus is 27. Vaccination status, 83% are unvaccinated or unknown. 1 dose is 12%, 2 doses is 5%. And hospitalizations, 58% of these cases required hospitalization for isolation or management of measles complications. Age group hospitalized, 66% under 5, 35% 5 to 19, 61% 20 and above. So it's got a significant morbidity and mortality associated with it when it comes to patients who have not been immunized who get measles. One dose is 93% effective. 2 doses takes it up to 97%. That's why there's a second dose. And we believe it's lifelong. There's no need for a booster when it comes to measles is concerned. So basically, almost everyone who has not responded to measles component with the first dose of MMR at 12 months of age will respond to the second dose according to the CDC. The second dose is administered to address primary vaccine failure, which is only about 7% to start with. Then it goes to less than 3%. The recommended routine immunization is starting first dose at 12 through 15 months of age, second dose at 4 through 6 years of age, at least 28 days after the first dose if they've not been immunized and they're older. The 2 doses can be given as close as 28 days apart. The vaccine is also available for children 12 months through 12, but patients greater than 12, the minimum interval between doses is 3 months instead of 28 days. And there is no measles vaccine by itself. It only comes in the combination. And you can also get the 4 combination with varicella added as well for children. But again, you wouldn't use that for older patients. So you've got 3 different vaccines that all contain the measles, but they're all combination vaccines. There is no measles vaccine by itself. Okay, so this is the update for, as of last fall, for COVID. That again is probably going to change at the advisory committee meeting in June. Let me put this back up since it fell out. Or maybe there's a good time before have they taken the food away? Oh, I'm sorry. It's not even 9 o'clock. I was going to give you a break at 9 o'clock. Okay, so COVID-19 vaccines. The FDA's Vaccine and Related Biologic Advisory Committee met in June of last year to discuss and make recommendations for the COVID vaccine. At that point in time, they decided we needed a new monovalent COVID vaccine to cover the Omicron strain, the XBB 1.5. So they told all the manufacturers needed to change their vaccines to cover this strain of the Omicron COVID virus. And it needed to be a monovalent vaccine. So all the other strains they had in the vaccines are no longer covered in the vaccine. So that's what the manufacturers were given. So Moderna and Pfizer and Novavax, which are the only 3 we still have, all made that vaccine. So 2 of those were available early last fall and 1 later last fall. So Novavax came along a little bit later. And you see the vote was unanimous, 21-0, that we changed the vaccine to this new version. So the new vaccine as of September, the ACIP and CDC recommended that we use this vaccine, and it got an emergency use authorization for patients greater than 6 months of age, and it was approved for those 12 and above or 6 and above, depending on which vaccine you got, the Moderna or Pfizer. But we still have an emergency use down to 6 months, and the Novavax vaccine is only emergency use, not a full FDA approval. So the JN1 variant of the Omicron vaccine is causing most of the cases as of January of this year. And this new vaccine is covering that variant of the Omicron strain. It says, as of January 12, 2024, only about 21% of adults have gotten the updated vaccine, according to the CDC. 1 out of 5 got the updated vaccine. As of February the 1st, the efficacy was 58% among those who received testing, 7 to 59 days after receipt of the updated vaccine, and 49% among those who got it, who received testing 60 to 119 days after the updated vaccine. So again, like the others, the titers go down after we get the vaccine. So it's not long-lasting effect. The strains change, and the vaccine does not last as far as the titers are concerned. Missed vaccine doses, this data comes from the United Kingdom in patients who did not receive all the doses of vaccine for which they were eligible. They had 4 times the risk of being hospitalized or dying from COVID compared to those who were fully vaccinated. And this was published in JAMA in January 31st of this year. New data from the UK, where they have a nationalized health system. So you can see getting vaccinated reduced the risk of bad outcomes significantly versus not being fully vaccinated. Rates of under-vaccination range from 33% to almost 50% across the UK. And they estimated 7,000 deaths and hospitalization could have been avoided if UK citizens had been fully vaccinated at the start of the 4-month study period. So again, the data supports getting these vaccines. And since last fall, the CDC has recommended the COVID vaccine as part of the routine immunization schedule. It's not a separate schedule anymore. It's in the CDC recommended guidelines for everybody. Oh, wow. Yeah, if I do the back and then come forward, we're okay. Okay, let's see. So this is missed doses of COVID vaccines. That's the one we just did with the UK. And here's the next one. These are the updated guidelines from the CDC from last fall for the current vaccines that are monovalent, specifically the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And there's a slight difference between the two vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine is not quite as potent as far as the amount of antigen or spike protein that's in it as compared to the Moderna. Pfizer is 30 micrograms, Moderna is 50. So there's a difference in the amount of the protein. So if they've been unvaccinated, they get 2 doses of Moderna at 4 to 8 weeks apart. And if they get the Pfizer vaccine, it's 3 doses, 2 to 3 weeks between the first and second, or 3 to 8 weeks, and then additional at least 8 weeks between the second and third dose. Now, with the old vaccine, there was concern the young males or adolescent males would get myocarditis or cardiac involvement from the vaccine. And the CDC had previously said if you spread the doses out at least 8 weeks, that appears to reduce the risk. So I'd be on the 8-week instead of the 3 to 8 weeks, stay on the longer side between doses based on that data from the past. And it's in the recommendation within the guidelines, but stay at the 8 weeks. Try not to give it too soon. So that's the one place they're different. But if at any dose of Moderna or any dose of the Pfizer BioNTech, Moderna, they only get 1 dose of the new vaccine. If they've only had 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine, then they get 2 doses of the Pfizer at least 8 weeks apart. And then if they've had 2 doses of the Pfizer, it's 1, and 2 or more doses of any Pfizer, it's 1. So this is the current recommendation for those patients who are ages 6 months to 4 years of age. These are for the young folks. And those are the ones that are emergency use authorization. These are ages 5 to 11. You see, 1 dose of either vaccine. Doesn't matter. Whether they're unvaccinated or they got any doses, it's 1 dose. Okay? And you can see the dose is a little bit different as far as micrograms. And here's the recommendation for those that are 12 and older, including us. So unvaccinated, 1 dose of either vaccine. You see the 50 micrograms or 30 micrograms, doesn't matter. If they've had 1 or more doses of any Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, it's 1 dose. And 1 dose down here as well. If they've had 1 or more doses of Novavax, and this is before Novavax brought out its updated vaccine. So those are the current recommendations for the vaccines, but there's an addition I'll show you in a minute. So in October, Novavax brought out their revised vaccine, and it's only for 12 and older, and it is only emergency use authorization. Okay, so Novavax also has theirs on the market now, and it's the same type of vaccine. It's monovalent, and it's also recommended you could use it if you need to. Novavax, new formulation, again, 12 and older, not for those under 12 years of age. This is also new. This is as of February of this year. The ACIP and the CDC said those of us who are at high risk can actually get a second dose, a booster of the new monovalent Omicron vaccine that came out last fall. Okay? So they vote 11-1. Those 65 and older may receive 1 additional dose of updated 23-24 formula COVID vaccine, either the Pfizer, Novavax, or Moderna, informed by the clinical judgment of a healthcare provider and personal preference and circumstances. Consideration for the additional dose may include the patient's risk of severe COVID-19 due to age and the presence of underlying medical conditions. The additional dose updated vaccine should be given at least 4 months after the last dose in healthy individuals and 3 months in individuals who are high risk. The CDC offered a new proposal with the idea of moving the timeline for annual COVID vaccine schedule to the following season to the June meeting. So June of this year, the ACIP meeting will discuss what we should do with COVID for as far as the vaccine recommendations for the coming season. So there's likely to be a modified vaccine they may or may not recommend in June to the manufacturers to begin in the fall. So we're likely to see, I'm going to predict, at least a yearly COVID vaccine booster. And like the flu vaccine, it's going to be continually monitored and maybe updated each year. So stay tuned. We'll find out in June what they recommend for this coming year. But right now, for your high-risk folks, we need to get them immunized with the first dose and potentially a second dose of a booster 3 to 4 months later if they haven't had either one. So those are things we need to think about. Because remember, as of January, only about 1 out of 5 patients have been immunized with a new vaccine. Yes? There are combination vaccines under development. There are also new vaccines for flu that hopefully we won't have to. They've identified additional targets that won't require an annual flu vaccine. So lots of things happening. And most of the things we're going to see are going to be the messenger RNA vaccines. And there's talk about putting 5 to 10 different organisms in one vaccine to reduce the number of vaccines. So it's something that's been under study for a long, long time, and we don't know where it's going to go. But vaccines are very, very effective, and we're going to see many, many more vaccines in not too distant future. And there are going to be lots of different combinations as well. I'll give you a couple other combinations in a minute. Safety. This is the myocarditis. It was mainly seen in adolescents 12 to 17 years of age, 1.8 to 5.6 times higher rate after COVID infection or after they get the vaccines. So we see it not only in vaccine-treated patients, but also those who get COVID. So it's probably related to the COVID, not just the vaccine. And the good news is it tends to be self-limiting and goes away on its own without significant therapy. And again, if you wanted to minimize the risk from the vaccine, there was a recommendation to split the doses when we had multiple doses by 8 weeks. We don't see that anymore because none of the folks we're talking about in this age group would get more than one dose. They're one dose folks, one dose and done. This just came out, assessment of cardiac death among adolescents and young adults after receipt of COVID, and death certificates in the state of Oregon. This was just published in April, so this is only 2 weeks old in MMWR. And what they looked at is 1,292 decedents, 16 to 30 years of age. 40 deaths occurred among patients who received the messenger RNA vaccine, and 3 occurred less than 100 days after vaccination. Among those 2 occurred in patients with underlying illness, and 1 had an undetermined cause of death. So limitations, we don't really know what the exact causes were. We don't know what happened if they occurred within 42 days or not. So these data do not support an association between receipt of the COVID vaccine and sudden cardiac death among previously healthy young people. COVID vaccine is recommended for all persons greater than 6 months of age to prevent COVID and complications, including death. So that was from the CDC on April the 11th of this year in MMWR. So that's an update on the cardiovascular stuff with COVID. This is something else that's not being used very, very often as much as we should, Paxlovid. It's effective but underused, according to, again, the CDC, and this is from JAMA, February the 20th of this year. Study of 1 million patients diagnosed with COVID between December of 21 and February 23, selected from the National COVID Cohort Collaboration Database, found that just under 10% of eligible patients received Paxlovid. Just under 10%, 1 out of 10, who were positive for COVID. Concerns about the widely reported rebound phenomenon linked to Paxlovid, unfamiliarity with the treatment, and cost might all be contributing to underuse because you now have to pay for it. It's not covered once the states ran out of it from the free supply that the government provided. It's now, you got to pay for it. And under the government patient assistance program, treatment remains free to those till the end of the year for Medicare and Medicaid, and for those who are uninsured, but insured individuals can enroll in the PAXS program, which can cover their out-of-pocket costs, may or may not. Patients who could benefit from Paxlovid should be prescribed it. My personal belief is that Paxlovid is a valuable drug. It's really important that the drug be used. And that was the authors of the study in JAMA that suggested it's effective, but only about 10% of patients are getting it. The other concern is rebound or long COVID if you get Paxlovid. So this is 15 participants, 20.8%. This is the reason it was Annals of Internal Medicine, the head of print last year, that raised the issue of long COVID with Paxlovid. 15 patients, 20.8% taking Paxlovid versus 1.8% untreated, developed long COVID. Persons with viral resistance had a positive viral recurrence, had a positive viral culture after a prior negative result. So that's what was required in this study. 8 of the 16 patients, 50% with viral recurrence, also reported symptoms of rebound. 2 are completely asymptomatic. No post-viral recurrence resistance mutations were detected. So that was the report that raised the issue. Does COVID cause long COVID or rebound? And this was small numbers from a letter in Annals of Internal Medicine published last fall. Oh, I'm on the wrong way. No. So this is the MMWR report, one by Patel and CDC colleagues and the other by the FDA, concluded that among patients with COVID-19, biologic rebound rates were similar between patients treated with Paxlovid and those who were not. FDA researchers analyzed the Pfizer data submitted to the agency and two randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. They concluded rebound can occur with or without antiviral treatment. So that was an update in February of this year from the CDC suggesting they do not believe that Paxlovid causes viral rebound or long COVID. So again, encourages the use of Paxlovid in appropriate patients who are high risk for bad outcomes. And sooner is better. This is the trial of Paxlovid for vaccinated and unvaccinated adults. And bottom line is there appears to be no significant difference. This is New England Journal already this year. And if we look at the follow-up, you can see it's about 27 days. Mean time at risk per event is about 13 days. Number of patients sustained elevation is the same. Median days, time to sustain alleviation is the same. So there's no major difference whether they've been vaccinated or not if they get Paxlovid. Works the same. There's no benefit or harm whether they have been vaccinated or not when it comes to Paxlovid. This is one that I've never seen and I've never recommended it. I've not seen it used. And this is relatively new, March of this year. The FDA gave an emergency use authorization for pemivibart, Pemgarda, by Invivyd. And this is basically a new monoclonal antibody to protect immunocompromised patients on the front end, not those who are infected, those who are at risk for getting infected, high-risk patients. So you can use it for prophylaxis. It's not for treatment, it's for prophylaxis only. Okay? And the agency did pull AstraZeneca's Evusheld, which was on the market until January of 23, for the same indication, because it was not effective against the Omicron strain, would not prevent you from getting the Omicron strain. So this one will. So it's a spike protein-directed inhibitor, attachment inhibitor for pre-exposure prophylaxis, pre-exposure of COVID-19 in adults and patients 12 and older who weigh at least 40 kgs. They're not currently infected with COVID and have no known recent exposure to individuals that's infected with COVID. So it's only as a primary prophylaxis for high-risk patients. So have moderate to severe immunocompromise due to a medical condition or received immunosuppressive therapy and are unlikely to mount an adequate response to a COVID-19 vaccine. So that's the group it's indicated for. Okay? Active treatment for solid tumor or hematologic malignancies. You see the indications for it here. CAR T-cell therapy, stem cell, all these folks would be potential candidates for this antibody. Moderate severe immunodeficiency, HIV, active treatment with steroids higher than 20 milligrams of prednisone, equivalent per day, immunosuppressives. The calculated serum neutralizing antibody titers were consistent with titers to show efficacy in prior clinical trials. So there is no outcome data based on titers only against the Omicron strain. The Canopy trial is ongoing to evaluate the efficacy for pre-exposure prophylaxis in adults 18 and older. We don't have that yet. So this is a emergency use authorization only for these high-risk folks with data to come from the Canopy trial. Black box warning. Anaphylaxis, is 0.6%, and more during the first and second infusion. Has to be administered in a setting where healthcare providers have immediate access to medications to treat anaphylaxis. Monitor patients during the infusion and for at least 2 hours after completion of the infusion. And you can see here the most common adverse events are listed, but infusion-related hypersensitivity, including anaphylaxis, and headache, fatigue, nausea. Certain variants may emerge that are not neutralized by this monoclonal antibody and may not be effective at preventing COVID in patients exposed to those strains. So right now, we know it works for the Omicron strain. Dose administration, it's a 60-minute IV infusion, okay? And you have to weigh 40 kgs or more, 12 and older. Initial dose is a single infusion. Repeat dose is administered single infusion approximately every 3 months. Repeat dosing should be timed from the date of the most recent exposure. And it takes 9 vials for each infusion. It's 4.5 grams, and it comes in a 500 milligram vial. It's going to cost a lot. So that's I've not seen it used, haven't seen it recommended yet, but it's relatively new, but it's out there, and it's the only one we have for pre-exposure prophylaxis in high-risk patients, monoclonal antibody. Not to treat it, to prevent.